All right, let's spend some time talking about the home front and the vision of of what the world will look like after the war. Primarily, the vision of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. First, the home front. Let's spend some time talking about the not so uh, remarkable, not so positive elements of the home front during World War II. Primarily because the positive elements of this war and this group of Americans that fought in this war and lived through the Depression, the positive elements have been beaten to death. Uh, and deservedly so, many would say. This generation that goes through Depression and then World War II is referred to as the greatest generation, as in the most substantial uh, generation of Americans in the history of America, definitely in the last century. Deal with a very substantial and volatile uh, decade and a half or so of depression, spread of fascism, global conflict, and come out on top into a very prosperous era in which their children are born, the baby boomers. The idea that everyone came together to deal with depression and then to defeat fascism, right? Not necessarily the case. The Tom Brokaw, narratives are real people telling their story, but there are certain elements of America at the time, like in America at any time, that is more divisive. Uh, there's more conflict than people tend to remember. One thing that is very memorable that is just has been discussed a lot lately, actually, a Supreme Court case revolving around this issue: uh, Japanese internment, right? The internment of Japanese American internment. Um, the bulk of these folks, I believe, half, it was two-thirds of the 110,000, there's numbers like 157,000, 130,000, 110,000 Japanese Americans, many of whom are born in the U.S., living on the west coast of the continental U.S., right? California, Oregon, Washington, primarily. You have a large Japanese East Asian population in the Vancouver, British Columbia area. That's Canada, though. The Aleutians, though, of Japanese ancestry in Alaska, also targeted. There is going to be an internment camp in Hawaii. Don't let anyone tell you they did not intern people in Hawaii. One of the largest internment camps is in Hawaii. Granted, I believe the highest estimate is 4,000 people were in the internment camp that existed on Honolulu or Oahu. And there were, the Japanese population in Hawaii was 1/3 of Hawaii's population. Right, so most people were not interned. Having said that, Hawaii was not a state. Right, Alaska wasn't a state either. Some Aleutians get interned. Some Japanese Hawaiians get interned. Right, some Alaskans of Japanese ancestry get interned. But the main focus is on the West Coast, which California, Oregon, Washington. These are already states. California primarily. These are already states. Right, there's already been a history of anti-Asian, xenophobic, racist sentiment for generations, and so in this instance, you have the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th. Shortly thereafter, there's a Japanese submarine that services off the coast of Santa Barbara, and launches a torpedo at an oil refinery off the coast of Oregon. There's what's known as the Battle of Los Angeles, where there's I think a Japanese submarine or possibly a plane um, flying over Los Angeles or off the coast of California near LA. And so there's a big push. There's on the West Coast where there's pressure to do something about this this visible yet very small Japanese American population. It's about one in California. The Japanese Americans are about 1% of California's population. And what do we do about them? Are they loyal? They're not like us, right? They look different. They speak different language sometimes. They're Buddhists. Sometimes they're not Catholic or Christian, whatever. This idea of them not being loyal, right? Uh, Definitely motivated by ethnic differences and cultural differences. Also motivated by the fact that although only 1% of the population of California, Japanese Americans represented 10% of the agricultural output. Successful vegetable farmers and other crops, successful business owners, homeowners, right? Uh, Foner in your textbook just describes this as a land grab. Internment is just a land grab because these folks are in February, 2 months after Pearl Harbor. Franklin Roosevelt is going to issue Executive Order 9066, which calls for the relocation of all Japanese living in a certain zone of the United States. That zone being the West Coast, the Western states. Relocated to relocation centers, internment camps, further, in the Midwest, inland, right, where they can't signal for another Japanese attack or something, because that's what these Japanese American kids were going to be doing. They're going to play baseball and be in the Boy Scouts, and all the while they're actually loyal to the Empire of Japan. It's completely ludicrous. Lots of folks are. Foner describes it as just a land grab, right? The primary motivation, and that's in many instances that's the case. Like, a lot of folks had to, it's a buyer's market. You are forced. You are being relocated. You don't know for how long. These camps are going to be open for the duration of the war in 1946. Many folks who are able to leave prematurely are men of military eligibility, right? Who go and serve, who agree to serve, and then they get out of the camps and go fight overseas. One Japanese unit that does this, a group of young men in the internment camps, agrees to fight in World War II, get out of the internment camps, goes on to become one of the most decorated unit in the war, right? Very loyal folks. They start Boy Scout chapters in the internment camps, play baseball in the internment camps. There is a gentleman named Korematsu who refuses to go to these camps, sues, goes to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court upholds the internment, like they would 50 years earlier they upheld segregation in the South. This is a case that's been brought up in the news a lot lately because it deals with the targeting of a specific group that is recently immigrated. Either your parents or you yourself immigrated here. Removing them, banning them. This whole xenophobic attitude our current president has around banning people from Muslim countries, stuff like that. So you hear Korematsu coming up a lot. The internment thing is a very good example of how far this vitriolic, xenophobic language and rhetoric can go, right? To the point where something like this happens, where people who come to America, who believe in the values of this country, believe in the democracy, believe in the American dream, work hard, earn enough to buy a piece of land, to buy a home, to run a business, and lose it all. They're forced to sell it to somebody for $1, or there are people that agree to I'll watch it for you. So you sign it over to me, right? Sign it over to me, and I'll watch it for you, and you'll get it back at the end of the war. That happens. A lot of Americans, white Americans, other Americans, did do that. Loyally did look over people's stuff and give it back. A lot of folks didn't. Kept it, sold it. The Japanese lost a substantial amount of property, and they're not going to, Japanese Americans, pardon me, and they're not going to be compensated for that by the United States government until 40 years later. In the 1980s, they're going to get, each a $20,000 check from Uncle Sam. Sorry you lost your house and your business during the war, because what we did was unconstitutional and a violation of your citizenship and your, human rights and your civil rights. But here's, a check for 20 grand. Go buy a Kia. Go buy a Kia, not go to IKEA. So Foner just describes it as a land grab. Similarly, a lot of folks believe the Salem witch trials. The women who were targeted were single, middle-aged, independent women, property-owning women, and it was sort of seen as a jealousy thing or a resentment thing, right? Accuse them of witchcraft, and where's your property now, lady? You're burning at the stake. It's that sort of thing. Like sort of jealousy of the success of a particular outside group, for lack of a better term. So, Executive Order 9066. The man in California who is in charge of carrying out this executive order, the Attorney General at the time of California, Mr. Earl Warren, who is going to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and 10 years after this is going to be the presiding Chief Justice in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which rules segregation, separation of groups based on ethnicity, separating people, like the internment camps did, like schools in the South did, or Kansas, or anywhere. Inherently unequal. It's inherently unequal. Was he informed in any way by his experience with internment? Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is definitely a negative notch on the FDR presidency there. Along with, there also was that one ship of Jewish refugees from Europe in the 30s that he did not allow in. We'll cut it at that. The Bracero program, contract labor program initiated by the United States government and the government of Mexico in order to bring people from Mexico, Mexican nationals, over to the United States as verifiable, documented contract labor, primarily in agriculture. There was a feeling that there would be a labor shortage once there was a draft, or once people transitioned into wartime jobs, went to serve in the military. And so there was this, from 1942 until 1964, there is this system called the Bracero program, which leads to nearly 5 million Mexican nationals coming over as contract labor, 4.5 million or so. It's one of the largest contract labor programs, public or private, ever, I believe. Definitely, as far as the federal government's concerned, the largest they ever did. Contract labor. On the one hand, as opposed to the mass repatriation, deportation of Mexican immigrants and also Mexican Americans, many of whom were citizens in their early 30s and into the mid 30s, as opposed to this sort of there's a legal framework, a legal system, a contract system by which people can come into the United States relatively easily and work, right, if they want to. And potentially have access to. I'm not sure what the numbers are on how many folks stayed. I know I know at least one. I have a neighbor whose father came here as a Bracero, and how many But so on the one hand, you have this sort of a transparent, a documented legal of means with which to get access to the United States, get work in the United States, and not have to have fear of living in the shadows, so to speak. Having said that, a lot of the regulations behind the Bracero program, the idea that Braceros should be paid within the range of whatever people around them are getting paid, right? If you move to Delano and you're picking lettuce, whatever people were getting getting paid before you got there, you should get also. That didn't necessarily happen. It was really exploited as a means with which to get cheap labor, right? Farm income, the income of agricultural labor went down during the Bracero program. One of the reasons is that these folks were not being paid as much, not because they wanted to work for less, but because the regulations with which they would have some sort of rights as workers, rights to certain basic wages, basic treatment, were not honored by employers. And unless the federal government was willing to enforce stuff like that, you could write a law down saying, sure, you have to pay these people the same. An employer doesn't, and nobody enforces that regulation, then that person's just not going to get paid as much, right? It's similar to if you recall the when we went over the Progressive Era and the Triangle Fire and looked at the garment industry today in Bangladesh. These building collapses, these building fires, there are building code regulations in Bangladesh. There's just no enforcement of them, right? So you can pass all the laws you want. If you're unwilling to enforce it or unable to enforce it, it does not make workers safer. Similar to the Bracero program, On the one hand, there's a transparent migration of sort of a free open border labor exchange or program where people can come in and work, but not necessarily the rights, the worker rights, and some certain human rights not necessarily recognized, not necessarily enforced, and is really the Bracero program is used in many ways as by employers to get cheap labor and exploit cheap labor. Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter. Some of you may be asking what a riveter is. I am too. No, it's a female industrial labor icon from World War II. Many people misclassify this. The Rosie the Riveter figure, the woman, white woman, in the with a Tupac, bandana tie on her head, joining the industrial labor force. It's really female women in industrial jobs. They had previously been excluded from either systematically or indirectly through traditional gender roles, blah blah blah. And also, women, more middle class. What we might call middle class. I don't know if that's the right term, considering that we're coming out of the Depression. They didn't necessarily use the same descriptions like middle class that we. I don't know if they had that then, or if they would describe it that way. Plus, there's a Depression. But what we're talking about is women in certain lines of work. In this case, building bombers, building tanks, doing industrial stuff for the war effort. They normally would have been excluded from. Remember, you go back 80 years before this, when the Civil War starts, women are not really seen in the medical profession. They're not seen as nurses. And especially particularly on the battlefield, right? Battlefield nurses. And by the end of the Civil War, that changes. Teaching, right? Teaching is not seen as the line of work for women necessarily early on. Not that there weren't that many. First off, there weren't that many schools in the 1840s and 50s as there were by the 1870s and 80s. But because of the need for soldiers, it opens up. There's a vacuum created in certain lines of work that women fill, right? So there's different wars create opportunities. They cause hardship and trauma, death, and also create avenues of opportunity at times, depending on the outcome. In this instance, it's relatively temporary at the time because when the war ends and there are 18 million men who had served in the armed forces in some level, many of them overseas. They come home. First off, there's no need to build bombers as much anymore. Sort of the military. We can get into the military-industrial complex later. But a lot of the idea is that these men are coming home to a prosperous economy. They're the breadwinners. This is our traditional attitude on the men and women. So women go home. Women go back into the home. First off, most women have always worked. Do not confuse this with women finally joining the workforce. It's women serving in different industrial jobs they normally would have been excluded from, and also married women, white, native-born married women working who normally may not have been working. Of course, in the Depression, that probably was different for everybody. But even before the Depression, women have always worked, right? In 1860, there are 2 million women in the South who were viewed only for their work, slaves, only for their work and their ability to produce more laborers, more slaves, vis-a-vis sexual assault or consensual sex with a white person or with a fellow slave or a free black person. But you know what I'm saying? They were only laborers. They were not even viewed as women in law, right? They were workers first and foremost. Immigrants, you have Irish women in the Northeast, and at this point, you've had the full influx of European immigration from Russia, from Poland, Italy, Spain, the Azores, right? These people are all working. Women on the West Coast, the few Asian women, Chinese women who are here, Japanese women, right? Latinos, all working. White sharecropping families in the South, all working, right? Child labor. So you have little girls who were peddling stuff in Manhattan with their Jewish parent, peddling different stuff to industrial, to garment workers on their lunch break or stuff. People had always been working basically. So don't confuse this with
women finally joining the workforce as a general statement, because you have to quantify or is it qualify or quantify? Qualify. You have to elaborate on the statement, right, and specify which women we're talking about. Similarly, it's like when if you take 17A, or for my Gavlin folks, History 1, it's called History 1. If you take that and we look at the Remember the Ladies Abigail Adams letter, many students will refer to it as a early feminism, or it's a clear feminist statement. It is not. You know, you have to sort of specify what Abigail Adams is advocating for, in the context in which she's advocating for it, and you don't just label it as something like that, right? That's very general. It's like saying, you know, it's kind of like saying Iraq, the invasion of Iraq was the next Vietnam, period, and that's it. You have to sort of, you know, highlight the differences and the similarities, and so yeah, that's Rosie the Riveter. For the Cold War, when the Cold War starts, it's this is not the only reason, but it is used as a justification for the superiority of the West. The idea that the substantial visible middle class in America in the 50s, the woman stays home. The man makes enough income to provide for an entire family that women don't have to work. So women being homemakers, leaving those industrial jobs after the war and returning to the home, is not only enforcing the traditional status quo, but is used as a tool in the Cold War effort, right? So conversely, the civil rights movement happens at a time when the protests that they are having, the demonstrations, and showing these civil rights folks getting beaten and and attacked with dogs and fire hoses, that's being broadcast all over the world. So it's in order to win over the hearts and minds of the world in this struggle against the Soviet Union, that something needed to be done about the issue of Jim Crow segregation. So, on the one hand, there's a reaction from the government to the benefit of certain groups, and on the other hand, you know, the idea of women staying home is kind of seen as a positive, a general good in the Cold War. So, but Rosie the Riveter, she's got a cool. I don't know if that's denim she's wearing, but definitely the Tupac bandana.
Okay. The GI Bill of Rights, 1944, originally pushed by the Roosevelt administration as an economic Bill of Rights. What's the difference? One is a GI Bill of Rights. The other one is not a Bill of Rights for the actual existence of economics, but for all Americans, right? What happens with the GI Bill, which affects more than 8 million veterans? There were 18 million people that served in the armed services. 8 million veterans are going to benefit from this program, utilize this economic bill, or this GI Bill of Rights. But originally, it had been pushed by the Roosevelt administration as a universal thing for all Americans. Basic guarantees, setting up, you know, government working towards ensuring people have a home, education if they wish to pursue one, healthcare, job training, which education is really just is job training, support necessary behind the Universal Economic Bill of Rights. So the GI Bill of Rights is what comes out of that. Not a pledge, not a guarantee to all Americans of basic, what some would consider basic necessities or basic rights. Some would say privileges, some would say entitlements, but the concept that health, education, they have a roof over your head, to have the ability to pursue work vis-a-vis, you know, and be qualified vis-a-vis job training and education, and healthcare, right? The idea that your health is, or lack of health, affects the common good, and we should all pitch into a system where we all just sort of have universal coverage. This does happen for GIs, though. They come home and have money to buy a house, have money to go to school, have money for job training, go out to the workforce, and is really a main component. Some would say a main component, or definitely a positive component towards the golden age of American society, arguably. From an economic standpoint, between 1946 and 1960, the gross national product doubles. Poverty is going to, you know, when Lyndon Johnson declares a war on poverty 20 years after World War II, it's going to be around 24%. So still 1 in 4 but not the 40% that existed in the 20s before. That was before even there was depression, right? So consider how many people were living in poverty. If 40% were living in poverty in the 20s, how many people were living at or near or below poverty in the 30s? A downside of, if you want to call it, downside of the GI Bill. Well, there's still a Jim Crow South. There's still a segregated West Coast with education and neighborhoods and whatnot for Black, Latino, Asian. You're gonna get a substantial African American population in Los Angeles, in Oakland. Richmond's gonna pop up out of nowhere. As a result of this war, the great migration of World War I that continues into World War II. So African Americans, other folks are gonna get GI Bill benefits, but if you want to live in a certain neighborhood, it doesn't matter if you got a loan. If they're not going to rent to you or sell to you, they're not going to do so. You still have a segregated country, segregated workforce in many ways, segregated neighborhoods, schools across several lines: white, and Black, and white, and Latino, and Asian, and so not just in the former Confederacy. They had segregated blood banks for blood transfusions and stuff during the war. Jackie Robinson is going to go through court-martial hearings for refusing to give up his seat on a military bus. There are going to be African American GIs who are going to be told to move from a car on a train to make way for German prisoners of war, so they could sit. So yeah, there's definitely some side to the GI Bill, another side to the GI Bill, basically, and also for another issue. Once again, this issue of ethnic segregation, and based on the supremacy of one ethnicity, this concept of race that developed early on in the United States is still maintaining itself in a problematic way for many people. That's something that's definitely going to be, and for a really good quality from a periodical, a thorough look at the housing issue that you talk about housing discrimination or discrimination in neighborhoods and planning neighborhoods and city planning and gentrification. If you want a really accessible and yet thorough look into that from a certain perspective, the case for reparations, which was I guess you call it expose, centerpiece article in the Atlantic in June of 2014. So the case for reparations, June 2014.